Hello, I'm Sarah Elliott, and I'm the chair of the Lifelong Discipleship Commission here at St. Thomas's. And we're very excited about kicking off all of our formational classes for the program year in September. And for the Forum series, we are going to start off the year with several parishioners who are going to talk to us about their stories of faith. And to kick off that series, today we're going to talk to Matthew Burdette. Is there anything you'd like to say?
I'm not a parishioner.
Who is not a parishioner. Yes, thank you. We're going to start off the Forum series by talking to Matthew Burdette, the rector here at St. Thomas's.
Right. I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, good.
Yeah, because I also have a story of faith.
Yes, you do. So let's begin.
Okay.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your experience with church and God as you were growing up? How were you introduced to God?
Right. So I grew up in an interreligious home where my mother was and remains a Seventh-day Adventist, and my dad was not anything. And so my first experience of church was my mother's church. My memories of it as a kid largely revolve around like the space and the occasional bits and pieces of sermons that I heard, and a sense of one of the things that's really palpable to me in my memory of church in particular is a sense of the sacred. I don't know if I didn't have the vocabulary as a child, but the sense that church was a holy place. It was a different place from all the other places, and that whatever was going on there was the most important thing. That was communicated really clearly, that like whatever else happens in life, what occurs here in church is the actual meaning of the whole world. That's kind of lofty, but conveniently true.
So how has your relationship with God evolved since you were a child?
Yeah.
Or your understanding of God?
Well, significantly. So I think, certainly there's just there are ideas you have about God that you shed as you get older. Some of them are really simplistic. Like I think maybe when you were a kid, you think of God as corporeal, or God having a body, and you realize that that's nonsense. Or you think of God as like living in a place called heaven, and that's not true either. And so, but I think more substantially, I know this sounds really peculiar, but I think one of the things that one gets to know in the Bible and in Christian worship is God's personality. And I think one of the things that's been most important in my faith development is an emerging sense of like what God is like. So I don't know how to say that well, other than to say there are things that are kind of on brand for God, and like things that are not. And all of that really revolves around Jesus in particular. Like I've come to recognize that Jesus reveals fully who God is.
That's wonderful. That's beautiful. Was there a time or a moment in time when you recognized that your faith was your own, or that you were developing your own faith, and that you weren't simply repeating what you'd heard?
Yes, absolutely. So when I was a high school student, I would have described myself as a non-practicing Christian. So I would have said that I believed the Christian faith was true, but it was not something that I was in any way participating in personally. When I went to college, I read the New Testament, and that's like a big part of my faith journey. and found it really surprising in a lot of ways. And by that point, I had developed, during adolescence, a really rather strong distaste for the church of my upbringing without having any point of reference to compare it to, or any vocabulary or theological knowledge to make sense of my discomfort with my church that I'd grown up in. But when I was around 18, 19, that was when I was beginning to not just ignore, but really properly deconstruct and reconstruct bits and pieces of my faith. And I think that continues. I'm still putting my faith together. I mean, it's not like, and this was when I was done, I think, people think I'm joking when I say this. I did all this academic work in theology. I really feel as though I had a good grasp of the Christian faith when I was done with my PhD, which speaks to either the slowness of my learning or or just how much time God takes with us, So, a bit of both.
So you said in high school that you had come to believe that the Christian faith was true, but you weren't practicing. Has there ever in your life been a season of doubt that you've had about God or God's existence?
Yes and no. So I have enough of a philosophical education that I know that when I say the word God, I'm referring to something really, I'll say it differently. I mean by God a lot of things, and I don't mean a lot of things. So I don't mean man in the sky with a beard, flying spaghetti monster. I think a lot of when people say that they don't believe in God, a lot of what they're denying are things that I would also deny exist. So there's that. So I've never had a real season of doubt in the existence of God. I think my times of I've had moments of emotional crisis where I'm like, does this mean anything? And then also the further I've gone into my faith, what I've experienced is that doubt and faith crisis is a part of the journey of faith. So for me, take for example the problem of evil and suffering. For a lot of people, the fact that there's suffering in the world is good cause to believe that there is no God. That being said, if there was no God, all the suffering and evil in the world would just be random, and it wouldn't really be evil. It would just be inconvenient or not our preference. So the fact that we're able to call something evil presupposes this transcendent good, which we would call God. And so for me, the problem of suffering, the problem of evil is something that occurs within faith. So there's all these theological problems, evil, the divisions of the church, why has God chosen to have this particular creation? Animal suffering is a problem for me. Why? Human beings might benefit from our suffering. We can learn from it or grow, but animals don't. But they suffer. And that's a part of God's good creation. There's something tragic about the world that God has made. But all that occurs for me within the context of faith. So not as an alternative to faith, but as a problem within it.
Within the faith.
Yeah.
That's good. So you said you grew up in the Adventist church.
Yeah.
So who or what brought you to the Episcopal Church?
Yeah. A few things and a couple of people. So so in my late teens, early 20s, I was denominationless. I was kind of ecclesially homeless and trying to figure out really where I wanted to be. By this point, I had developed a pretty critical view of the Bible. So the kind of evangelical or fundamentalist views of the Bible as being inerrant or simplistic, in their like historical accuracy or something. That was no longer an option for me. And so I was looking for a church that had, let's say, a really large playground to play in intellectually. One that was courageous about social issues. I also wanted to find a church that I knew that I was going to change my mind over the years about many things. And like the person that I am today versus the person I was when I was 22, like I have very vastly different attitudes, opinions, theologically and otherwise than I did. And at no point have I thought my way out of the Episcopal Church. And that was something that was really important to me, that I wanted to be able to be in a denomination where my growth as a person wouldn't grow me out of the community. And so I'd come across some Anglican theologians in my reading, come across the prayer book and the liturgy, and those things attracted me. The rootedness in history and tradition were huge in my mind. I wanted something that was Catholic in the best sense, but also embraced those things from the Reformation that were important. And so I became friends with the rector of Christ Church in Bordentown, New Jersey. Long story, not important. And we would spend a lot of days together one summer when I was in college, and we would say morning prayer and talk theology. And slowly but surely, I found my way into the Episcopal Church. I finally got confirmed when I was 24 years old. So it's been just over 10 years since I was officially made an Episcopalian. So there you go.
Well, we're glad you're here.
Me too.
So is there a Bible passage that has been particularly meaningful or important to you?
Yeah. Let's see. Different ones at different times. For my really formative faith years in my early 20s, the first half of the letter to the Ephesians, just like Ephesians 1-3, were enormously significant in my thinking. So part of it was I read Ephesians when I was 18 years old, and it was like this enormous slap in the face, and like just conceptually, it was like being splashed with cold water or something. So the letter begins with this huge announcement that God has, from before the foundation of the world, chosen us. So there's this huge view of God being in charge of everything, that God has a plan, that like my free will may exist, but like relatively small and insignificant in the big picture. And that in God's eternal plan from before creation, God chose human beings to be in this intimate communion with him through the incarnation. That the incarnation was God's intention when God created. Like, that blew my mind. And then it proceeds, the text proceeds to say, and God raised Christ from the dead and raised us up with him. And like right there, realizing that like the ascension, even like to the authors of the New Testament, like we think they're stupid and that they think that Jesus like flew into the sky somewhere. But like they have this nuanced view of what's going on when Christ is raised from the dead and seated at God's right hand, and God has seated us with him in the heavens. So they have this incredible ability to be nuanced and metaphorical in a way that, again, is a kind of like modernity is the belief that everyone that came before us was stupid. So part of what it was for me was the realization that the ancient world was not full of stupid people, and that it had this view of God that was far loftier and bigger than whatever I had imagined, and that what occurs in Jesus is not like a simplistic God responding to human sin because we somehow messed up in Eden. It was like God chose to have creatures, and God chose to have creatures in order to be among them as one of them, and that we have no choice in the matter, and God doesn't care. And that to me was so offensive. I was so enraged as an 18-year-old, but then it became like this central part of my faith. Where now, like, so for a lot of years, I would say, like, a lot of the theological writing I've done has been in some distant but subtle way, like commentary on Ephesians. Yeah, I don't really talk about that much, but
Gonna have to read Ephesians now.
it's fantastic. It's fantastic. The other thing, there's one little verse in Philippians where Paul is writing from prison to this church that's also facing persecution. But one of the things that he says right at the beginning of the letter, which I've always taken as a great comfort, being the great sinner that I am, is that God will bring to completion the good work that he has begun in you. That is a text that I've referred to again and again. The other passages in the Bible, I like most of the Bible. Psalm 139 is a psalm that I come back to again and again, which is again about God's greatness, that you can try to run away, and wherever you run, there God is. I mean, that to me is both a threat and a promise. So,
Like, are there? I know that you read the Bible a lot professionally. You prepare for services and for sermons. Do you incorporate reading the Bible devotionally, or do you have other spiritual practices?
Yes. So certainly sermon prep is a big part of my devotional life. I feel like you get to a point where either you're doing it for work or you just find a way to make this your spiritual life. And so I think this is an important point to make. Certainly, like, as a person who preaches, one could get the impression that I'm somehow like occupying a vantage that most people don't occupy, or occupy a spiritual life that most people have no access to. And actually, that's just not really the case. I mean, I face all the same spiritual challenges as anybody else. So, to me, reading the texts of Scripture each week in preparation for preaching, I'm usually preaching to myself. And that feels really vulnerable most of the time. I don't know that it's always apparent that I'm preaching to myself or apparent that I'm being vulnerable. One of my regular spiritual practices, I can't say I do it every day, but I do it many days, is during my drive to work in the morning, I do 10 minutes of Lectio Divina, where I listen to a gospel text and then pray about it. I do morning prayer, so that's a regular reading of Scripture. Sometimes I just find myself thinking about like a text, like a verse of the Bible, and sometimes that's the most satisfying thing.
Are there aspects of your spiritual practice that is challenging to you, or that you've struggled with?
Yeah, I never feel like praying. I mean, I pray with great regularity, but I'm prayer avoidant as a person. Like, spiritually, I don't feel. It often feels to me like, and I guess this is the particular thing that I need to work out with God. It's like, what is that about, right? Why is it that I feel like I'm being called to the principal's office or something? But yeah, I find prayer extremely difficult. And it's not just because, I don't know what I'm doing when I'm praying, or I don't know what prayer is affecting. I mean, all those questions I've thought about, and I feel like they're kind of settled for me. But by and large, I think because, I'm going to like analyze myself here, I love being in control. And I think prayer is that reminder that I'm not in control. And I'm also very deeply aware of my own flaws and limits. And I know that even if nobody else knows about those, God does. So prayer is the one place where I have to be really honest with myself. So, yeah, I think praying is really, really hard. It's much easier for me to like talk to you than to talk to God.
Are there times in your life when you have felt particularly close to God, or on the other hand, times when you have felt remote from God?
Yes, to both. Absolutely. Ironically, maybe not ironically, some of the times that I felt closest to God were times that I was struggling the most. Emotionally, spiritually, times where I felt very much like I was about to be far from God. I felt very much that God was close to me, or that God spoke to me. And then there are those times where it just feels like utter silence, where I'm not hearing anything. Or I've never been a person who like feels God's presence. The principal concept, and this kind of goes back to what I said about Ephesians, the principal thing in my spiritual life is the trust that God holds everything, and that my life is going to occur within the boundaries of what God has already determined will happen in his creation. So, I mean, and that might well end up with me being dead prematurely or dying a martyr, or, right? I mean, following Jesus is not like it's not a guaranteed nice life, but for me, the proximity to God has a lot to do with not worrying about the future, not worrying about my situation. But yeah, there are lots of times in my life when I have felt very unspiritual, very much like my day-to-day life goes on without reference to God, or I'm ignoring God's presence, or I'm not attuned to it. But one of the things, not to be preachy, but one of the things is Jesus dies, and one of the words that he says on the cross is his confession of the sense of abandonment. My God, why have you forsaken me? And one of the things that I've taken from that spiritually is that a particular paradox emerges, which is that in our greatest extremity from God, we become most intimately close to God, because that's where Christ is. Do you know what I mean?
That's beautiful, beautifully said.
Thank you.
So as we wrap up, is there a question that I haven't asked you that you would like to talk about?
Oh my gosh. Well, I don't know.
Or is there something about your spiritual life or your spiritual journey or your faith maturation that you would like to share?
Oh, I think it's interesting that we haven't talked about my call to the priesthood.
Yes, we have not done that. Should we do that?
No. I actually think it's good that we didn't. I mean, because in some way, every baptized person has a vocation. Mine happens to be this one.
Well, let's talk about call for a second.
Okay.
Because one of the things that you said when you were talking about your prayer life was about when you would hear God.
Yes.
And I assume that you did not mean Charlton Heston's voice coming down from the clouds. So what is it like?
What is it like to hear God?
To hear a call?
I think it's different for different people. Yeah, I'm hesitating because this is where doubt creeps in, right? There's always this deniability that, like, was this all in my head? But there are those times in your life where you're grappling with something, and then somebody who's completely unaware and unrelated says something to you that they don't know what they just said, but they said like the right thing. That's happened to me again and again and again with my sense of that I ought to marry Evie, with my sense that I should become a priest, with my sense that I should come here to St. Thomas. Many things. So a lot of it is the voices of other people around you. For me, it's a lot of the voices of other people around me. There's also a sense of rest or peace that I get, a sense of being settled on something in a way that, like, when you know when something is like not right, you know, kind of the absence of that has been a part of discernment for me. Yeah. But yes, I mean, some of it, you know, I'm a human being, so I think my very first thought about becoming a priest came in the form of me thinking to myself one Sunday, gosh, I could do a better job preaching that sermon, which is so arrogant. Maybe that's going to get edited out. But either way, like, I remember just thinking, like, maybe I should preach.
Well, I've heard Evie tell a story about when you were a child and teaching Bible stories to your friends.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've always found the Bible interesting, I guess. I think the people around me seem to all be very unsurprised that I turned out to be who I am. I was shocked, but that's, you know, that's a conversation for me and my therapist. Yeah.
Well, good. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about your spiritual journey and your faith journey, and I'm eager to hear conversations with other Christians.
As am I. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thank you.